The working and middle classes today face a less certain future than any of their ancestors. We don't know in 30 years what jobs will still be performed by human beings and which will be completely automated. Even if you do everything right, get good grades, follow the advice of your parents, your teachers, your community, and go into a STEM field, go into computer science or engineering, there is still the possibility that your chosen career trajectory could evaporate in the face of AI. We have historically been pretty bad at anticipating what sorts of things that AI can do. But there are other threats economically: globalization, outsourcing, insourcing, crowdsourcing. There are all sorts of dynamics of global economic paradigms that are hard to track, that are difficult to predict, and therefore difficult to plan for. So we don't know what sorts of jobs will be available for us in the course of our lives, let alone what sorts of economic prospects our children might have. This is obviously one of the reasons why people are talking about a universal basic income, because a large segment of the population may just become irrelevant in the face of automation and other sorts of economic innovations. But that's not the only species of threat. It's not just economic. It is also reproductive. If you are a middle-class person in America of a traditional American stock, the genetic integrity of your group may be undermined by immigration or simply by our own prosperity, because in the absence of the kind of selective pressures that operated in pre-industrial society, the mutation load is going up, the general factor of intelligence is going down. The prospects for your line of descent in the general population are not good compared to your past if you're a middle class heritage American. There's also the possibility of civilizational collapse, economic collapse, the peak oil crisis, running out of resources. You can discount any of these individual possibilities, but there are good reasons and smart people believe all of these possibilities are likely. There's also the threat of a climate change. People do think that we might be going into a new ice age. People think that we might be going into a much warmer period in Earth's history. So there's a lot of room for uncertainty, and the individual and their individual line of descent is just not left with much to hold on to. Like, how do you provide a future for yourself and your family? That question is becoming much more difficult to answer. It may be in 50 years that humanity itself is eclipsed by some form of superintelligence, whether that's good old-fashioned AI or some other kind of greater than human level mind. It may be in 50 years that we are squatting around campfires in the ruins of this civilization. It could go either way. And so we want to be able to plan for the future, so we have to think about these possibilities. It has occurred to me in the last year that I can't simply ignore transhumanism and AI, because a lot of these things are already happening. And the capacity of the elites to plan, to network, to predict the future, to act accordingly, to leverage their investments effectively and suppress competitors ever more effectively, that's happening, right? We have to catch up. We have to understand what we're up against and not just caricature the situation by focusing on one particular kind of threat, like the demographic change or something along those lines. It's just not good enough. So in this video, I'm going to focus on the superhuman intelligence or superintelligence threats. And a lot of this I'm getting from Nick Bostrom's book, Superintelligence. I'm planning on going through a couple more books on AI in particular, because that's one of the biggest threats. But this is not just artificial intelligence. There are a few other varieties of greater than human level cognition that may be looming. I ranked these from the most likely to the least likely, and from the least threatening to the most threatening. And this is technically not super intelligence, the last one, but it is the most threatening. So first of all, embryo selection with in vitro fertilization is already happening. Diseases are being screened out of certain populations using IVF, where you get multiple embryos from the sperm and egg of the father and mother, and you can test these embryos genetically and decide which one you will implant in the uterus. And obviously, if you're religious, you might have a problem with this, because these are human embryos with their own genetic code, and you're extinguishing human life when you engage in this form of selection. But nevertheless, it is happening, and the capacities in this technology are enormous. Because you don't just have to screen out diseases, you can also look for the kinds of alleles that are associated with high IQ or with any other desirable trait. And you can obviously use more embryos than just a few and get a larger pool to select from, but that doesn't give you that much greater returns on your investment. The better thing to do is to do multiple generations of selection, and this is actually possible because you can convert these embryos into sperm and egg cells and combine the sperm and egg and get a new genome. I mean, presumably this process doesn't involve this kind of implicit incest. I guess there's a way to get around it. Nick Bostrom was talking about or writing about how that actually takes place, but it is possible, it's technologically feasible, and somebody's going to do it at some point. But you could get multiple generations in the span of just a couple years, and the time that it takes to mature these cells in the right way and convert them into the sperm and eggs. But doing that, you could get potentially a brood of people coming out of this kind of IVF selection could have average IQs in the 160s or 180s or greater. We just don't know. It would be like the most intensive kind of selection possible in conventional terms. Now, the next step is going beyond conventional selection and simply editing the genome itself. Obviously, we have the technology to do this, but if you can screen a genome for random mutations and eliminate those, you will likely increase the fitness of that individual. Because most random mutations are deleterious, so you just have to identify the random mutations, take those out, and you get something approximating the ideal human specimen right off the bat. You can also insert genes that are associated with high IQ, and we have a very good understanding of what sorts of genes those are. You can insert genes for a propensity to develop certain kinds of muscle fibers. Obviously, you can alter height. You can alter all sorts of things by gene editing, and that all of these things can be combined as well, which is one of the scary parts about this. But that combined with like machine learning algorithms can identify the best possible kinds of genetic combination, and with simulating what the resulting individual would be like. You can do a lot of selection through the biological means of gene editing and embryo selection. And once people start doing this to produce higher performing offspring, others simply won't be able to compete unless they go along with it. So if all the other options here fail, and that's all you have to work with, there will be a huge pressure to keep up and participate in this alongside. So if you're not wealthy, then you won't be able to achieve the optimum kinds of techniques for your reproduction. Your offspring will fall further behind. The gap between the rich and poor will widen. It's already widening, And the rich are already using artificial intelligence to grow more wealthy. People using AI to trade on the financial markets, using it obviously for search algorithms and things online and advertising and all sorts of applications. The elite are smarter than they were in one sense. Maybe they don't have as many geniuses as during the Victorian era, but they can do more stuff because they have these expert machines helping them in all these various capacities. So this is happening now. This sort of thing will continue. Another kind of superhuman intelligence we have to worry about is cyborgs, people equipped with brain chips that augment their abilities in various ways. Nick Bostrom didn't think this was as likely a prospect, but if you can have a neural link set up that allows groups to communicate more effectively, you can create hive minds. And I just wanted to throw this up there because that is a prospect. If somebody has access to more information, they never have to go onto their phone and look something up and wait for the lag time. If they're always connected to the internet, they're always, all that information is at their fingertips, or closer than that, right? It's in their head. Then education is almost unnecessary. So if technological challenges regarding putting wires in someone's brains can be overcome, then the prospects there are not necessarily higher general intelligence, but just much more knowledge available to people and much greater capacity for altering the system electronically. They can write faster and read faster, in other words. They can become more relevant online and elsewhere. So if you don't have this ability, again, you're going to fall behind, and the elites with money to afford this sort of thing and without the compunction to resist it, that gap's going to widen. Then there is, of course, good old-fashioned artificial intelligence, and the possibilities there we can't imagine. The most likely prospect is that someone develops a seed AI using some kind of genetic programming where it's an evolutionary environment and you have multiple rounds of self-improvement. So it's an iterative self-improving algorithm that modifies its own structure. Once you have that in principle, you will have a kind of intelligence explosion, and we simply can't predict what that kind of intelligence will be inclined to do. Combined with research in, this is like the connectionist school of artificial intelligence, research into the structure of the brain, the structure of neurons, we might end up simulating with some kind of connectionist architecture, parallel processed neural network, seed AI program. We might end up inadvertently simulating some other aspects of what the brain does, like seeking power or seeking to reproduce itself or something like that. But if there is an evolutionary aspect built into this kind of seed AI program, then it might just reproduce to excess, and it might, in order to improve itself, it might seek greater and greater computational resources, which would entail, controlling the world's computing resources, meaning the governments wouldn't have access to them, the AI would. And what it does with them, it might end up, if it can model human society and the world around it using the information that it gets online, then then what it can do is to engineer human society and to build robot plants, to create the ideal workers, to build larger computers, to give it more processing power. If that's what it's designed to do, to improve its own structure iteratively, then that's what it's going to do. And if it's smart enough to understand how to do that strategically and coercively perhaps, then that's a possibility. So that sort of artificial intelligence explosion, intelligence researchers, or rather artificial intelligence researchers, have different opinions as to when they think that kind of intelligence might be possible. But 90% of them believe or rather, the majority of them place with a 90% certainty, according to multiple surveys, within the century. And so that's pretty close. If that is a possibility, then the embryo selection, gene editing, and Neuralink will basically become irrelevant. Now, the extension of that would be gray goo, where we don't have a runaway intelligence, we have a runaway mechanical process, some kind of nanoscale robot system. Imagine you build like a universal nanoscale component designed such that it can be combined into all sorts of different nanoscale assemblages, and then macroscopic assemblages, and this base component can be decomposed easily from carbon or from some other abundant material, and you set off some kind of evolutionary dynamic where you have these nanoscale machines building, replicating, synthesizing new base modular components. Artificial intelligence might be inclined to make something like that to optimize the construction of new computers. Or it might be some, terrorist who, say it's in Mendham, and he has a lot of, he has access somehow to the nanotech lab at the local university. And he decides he's going to wipe out the species because that's what Mendham wants to do. So he goes and builds the gray goo. So that's probably the worst threat, and we want to avoid this. So let's think about, now the rest of the video is how to respond to these threats. And obviously that's really difficult, because if a lone, evil scientist can develop the gray goo, or even a seed AI, then all bets are off for the rest of us. So realistically, if you want to avoid the gray goo or runaway artificial intelligence, you can't have evil geniuses operating on their own computer, operating out of their own garage. People like freedom, but the tendency, I think John Robb or something like that, he wrote a book about this thesis that over time, the offensive capabilities of smaller and smaller, less organized units have been becoming greater and greater. So in the past, to really pose a threat to the system, you had to have an army, effectively. Then a band of terrorists or multiple bands of terrorists are actually more threatening to the system than an organized force. And then you can have lone terrorists, hackers, people of that nature who pose the greatest threat of all, and potentially an existential threat to the species. With the technology that is available, not necessarily today, but perhaps in 20 years, it's the kind of stuff that would be available commercially. So to avoid this, you have to have a literal global government or something like it regulating what sorts of technology people have access to. And if they do have access to certain forms of technology, they have to be surveilled. And that's an existential, argue me out of this position, because to me it just seems inescapable. If these technologies are possible, and we don't know for sure if they are or are not. And so as we approach the capacity for maybe making a breakthrough, in order to secure the existence of the species, we have to prevent people from researching these things. And so the rest of what I'm going to talk about pertains to how you as an individual move forward in light of these threats. But realistically, there has to be a global component. There has to be some kind of global regulation to prevent this sort of thing. And the globalists that exist now, many of them don't care if this happens. They actually want that to happen. I don't know why, but they think that if they're our mind children, if they're the descendants of our intelligence, that's good enough. But according to my philosophy, if we have reincarnation, or if you're a Christian, you believe in heaven, it's the fate of the human soul that matters. And so if we kind of skip the human stage, step right over where that could lead and be replaced by some other form of intelligence, then that basically sets us back. If you believe in reincarnation, it sets us way back spiritually, or if you believe in the traditional heaven-hell distinction, then basically that could create a hell on earth, or it could be like the end time scenario from the Bible. That's what a lot of people see in this sort of prospect. So some sort of global system has to be in place. I don't know if I can trust the globalists who exist now, and so that global aspect has to be considered when we think about designing systems to prepare for this. So these things are threatening to the individual. These first ones, embryo selection and Neuralink, that's threatening to the individual if they have to compete economically with the elites who can afford these things as individuals. But if they're networked into collectives, if they are a part of a collective economic unit that has perhaps a caste within it which engages in the embryo selection, if that's the peak strategy for achieving optimal intelligence, then they can benefit from the fruits of the labor of that caste within their own organization. Or they have a group within their organization that uses Neuralink or uses expert AI in various capacities, or has a networked structure that allows communication between the whole system, utilizing some of these technologies, and synthesizes a group strategy to compete in the ever-changing economic circumstances. But the way it's looking now, this is a matter of survival, and it's kind of a positive thing if you think about it. My battery's gonna die, so I'll get back to this in a second. Okay, so it's a good thing in that what this means is that there is an existential threat facing almost everyone, unless you're a member of the elite now, that most people don't know about or aren't willing to think about really. And so you have something, you have information and a strategy to deal with it that people really need. So as I discuss the kind of system to build in light of these threats, and they're real threats, if the system continues chugging along. Of course, you'll also want to consider what sorts of system will be resilient to not only these tech-oriented future threats, but also more violent and destabilizing, chaotic threats. But anyway, you have something that people need and you can sell to them, that they have an incentive to cooperate with the kind of system that you're talking about. They have something to gain. And that means that you, as someone organizing, who's close to the center of organization of this kind of system, have a founder effect genetically, potentially, and also a early investor benefit or whatever. There's probably a term for what I'm looking to express there, but you get what I'm saying. So we need a system. I'm going to represent that with a box. And outside the system, you have environment. And one of the functions that needs to be carried out is identifying threats from the environment. And that system needs to process information. So we have an information processing system that addresses its environment according to some kind of utility function. So we need basically a Bayesian agent here. We need to assign various probabilities to the kinds of future states we project based on the models that we generate. So you need utility function. And these can be emergent properties of the system as a whole, and not all components within the system have to bear these in mind, but they have to contribute to it in some way. So the utility function, you need modeling / prediction. You need input from the environment. You need self-modeling and adaptation. And you need an evolutionary system, therefore, because no system is going to last forever unless it incorporates mutation. It has to change in certain ways, but the general features will be easily modeled in this kind of Bayesian approach, but it has to model various potential futures, assign probabilities, observe, take in new inputs, and aim towards futures with its action based on some measure of utility. And we can, what's the best way to measure utility? Probably something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, something like that. At the very top, you need the system to continue existing, because if it doesn't exist, it can't do anything else. So there's an existential requirement, and then beyond that, you need system growth, you need system optimization, you need, and then obviously individual optimization. Recruiting new members in to the system is an aspect of growth. So that's in the abstract, like what needs to be built. You need groups of people cooperating such that you are able to collectively evaluate the utility function. And again, not every individual has to think about the utility function in this, but the collective behavior has to generate some measure of utility. Now, I'd be inclined to think metaphysically here and go to some kind of theory of ethics and model the good and come up with a justification for why is this alternative trying to keep up better than succumbing to the elites possessing these technologies. On the one hand, you are contributing to the kind of environment for your offspring, if you have them, that will lead to them losing power and therefore capacity for altering the system. And so if you seek the good, your good-seeking behaviors won't spread. And so you are contributing to the kind of world in which evil wins over good. And according to my theories of reincarnation, you move into worlds that you've contributed to. Or not necessarily the very same world, but the kinds of maxims that you live by, those will be the kinds of maxims that the world obeys that you're going to move into. So if you let evil win, then you're going to hell, because hells are worlds in which evil has won. Evil being defined by the pursuit of will over truth, power over divinity or whatever, to make it symmetrical. And so, this could be used, this same sort of model can be used by elites who are using Neuralink and embryo selection and artificial intelligence and networking their functions together and creating a collective conception of their mutual good, and they're modeling the environment, predicting it. In a lot of ways, they are doing this. That's what the Rockefeller Foundation, the Royal Society, that's what all these big, well-funded agencies do. They create collective epistemologies through the university systems, through independent research that they fund. Through all sorts of means, they generate a model of the world that they agree we should agree to this model. What sets this apart? Well, it's in the specifics and it's in the utility function. You do have to have some kind of spiritual ideal in order to seek the good, and that spiritual ideal can simply be seeking the truth. Because I don't think that Rockefeller Foundation, Royal Society types are seeking the ultimate truth, the nature of reality. Otherwise, they wouldn't diminish the relevance of metaphysics and push up materialistic narratives that undermine the role of consciousness and things like that. If they really wanted the truth of the universe, they'd be conscious of the dilemma that Plato demonstrates in the Republic with the cave. You don't know, no matter how well you know the dynamics and limited ontology of a particular theory, So like in physics, we have atoms, we have various things. No matter how well you know those things and their dynamics, you can't know if that system relies upon a yet more fundamental system that you don't have epistemological access to. So to really understand reality, and there's obviously the prospect that your soul is tied into that greater reality, that you're not really of this world, you're of some other higher world. But you can't know that unless you engage in metaphysics, the kind of thinking that, you know, the nobler schools of philosophy have dwelt upon, in my opinion. So you have to keep that aspect, but also, like, in order to do that, you have to create an environment in which that is possible. Now, part of that is the cultivation of genius. So you need large populations. This can't be a small group doing this. You need a large pool of people to get that kind of genius contemplation. You need arts and culture. You need all of the things, the accoutrements of civilization. You need that to cultivate genius. So again, look to the Republic. What does Plato talk about? How to educate children in that kind of state, how to select from young, promising people, the future leaders. Those sorts of things must be considered. But rather than engage in this kind of Republic thought experiment, we're going to have to look at it in a little bit more evolutionary terms. And this also has to do with the development of the institution in the first place. You need a seed community. And all of those properties I just listed have to be carried out by the seed. The DNA, the original DNA of what's going on here, it has to set truth as the highest ideal in spiritual terms. And then within that have a hierarchy of needs for the institution itself, have the capacity to model, take inputs, and always increase the ability of all of these various inputs, outputs, self-monitoring, all of these various capacities, and have checks on where efficiency can improve within the system. So you need a time scale for these sorts of self-observations and updating of the models. Now, the academic frameworks that I've talked about in the past, years ago and more recently, always involve some kind of, there's a cyclical nature to it. Every week, the system kind of updates itself by mandatory communication throughout its nodes. And I think to really build this kind of seed system, you need collectively inclined people with high IQ, with a spiritual ideal, with the vision that we can someday contribute to the global system that will prevent these human extinction level threats. So it's a big ask, I suppose. But what you need is that kind of seed. It doesn't have to be perfect. You're not going to get it right the first time, right? That's the evolutionary principle here. You do your Republic thought experiment, build it in the best way you know how, and then take the people, the most promising people or groups, depending on the size, and use resources that you get from this starting experiment and create a new experiment. And I'm going to, demonstrate this in this sort of way. But really, the more practical model would be you have this existing in perpetuity, spitting out occasionally, whenever it can afford it, new colonies. This whole grid has to be connected still in terms of the information processing. And that's why truth has to be held. It's a cooperative competition in one sense, but cooperative in the sense that they have to share a model of the world. That highest level philosophy has to be unified. And so I think that the seed has to be the collective university, the ideal of the university, putting all that knowledge together. And the individual colonies would likely have economic specializations. You could also have, specialist universities at the same time. And I suspect that the academic function and the economic function and the social function all have to be radically integrated in order to compete with these sorts of things. I think a holistic conception of life and knowledge and action has to be generated, something radically different. Yeah, the most effective way for this to work is it continues in time, spits out colonies when it can afford it. I'm modeling it like an exponential kind of replication thing. You monitor the performance of these offshoot colonies economically, what they're contributing to the ability to expand, and you support failed experiments for a time, but after a set period of time, whatever is judged by a utility function to be the optimal time, you eliminate failed experiments. You can start by changing leadership. You can start by various means, but you eliminate failed experiments, redistribute to successful experiments. And also each of these can put out new colonies. So the more successful models act as new branches of the evolutionary tree, which is just obvious, right? You need this variation. So you need a degree of central control, but it needs to be priestly control. Academic, science and the priestly function are the same for our purposes here. So you need that shared model coming from the university, branching out into these various kinds of communities. Each of these communities operates according to different political praxis, and that's the real warrior function. It is the charismatic leader of men. That's what you need in each of these communities to start it. Some that can be a priest warrior, as in the Indo-European tradition, we often have warrior priests. So you have that warrior element creating political diversity, organizing in different ways, sometimes employing embryo selection, sometimes doing gene editing, sometimes during using Neuralink. But it may be something also where you develop a global platform to share information and take in information from the university. So imagine everyone has, an app on their phone where they're networked together such that they provide inputs on economically relevant information. So you're out there, say you're an agricultural settlement and you're putting out bales of hay or something, and you put how many bales of hay you got. Maybe you take a picture of where you're working, and that information goes up the chain that then evaluates what's efficient in this process and what is someone else doing that where work can be integrated. You use AI in that partly. You also use crowdsourced knowledge. An example of what I mean by that is you can put out questions to the whole group. So you might get a notification and you basically have just a little problem come up. You have a picture and the question is, what do you do? Or what is in this picture? So that's one form of pattern recognition where you can get a whole bunch of inputs or whatever. There's all sorts of applications where you can query large numbers of people, statistically aggregate the results, and then incorporate that in some kind of artificial intelligence program algorithm to optimize various functions. So this is a high-level overview. I don't know all the details of what that would entail, but the principle is expanding the capacity for global input. The system, the collective hive mind, has to be able to get inputs from all over, so everyone needs to be able to put in what they're doing. That's self-monitoring at the organizational level, and it's environmental modeling at the level of what people are actually on the ground working with. That sort of system also can give them information that they need. So if you have a question, you type in the question and the hive mind solves it for you. This means maybe the question is broken up, but for different topic experts, or maybe artificial intelligence, or Google search or whatever. Maybe you don't want to use Google. Maybe you want your own platform. But a typical search can provide the answer, and this is all integrated. And you learn what questions people are asking over time, and this integrates the whole system. Now, I think at the religious level, one of the principles to think about is that how do you sell people this idea? You want people involved, and you want people to believe that it's idealistic and good, as opposed to some of the more destructive aspects of elite transhumanist agendas. So what do you want? It's a return to nature ideology using high tech. That's my inclination. So you would say basically like every person, you were born on the earth, you're entitled to a piece of the earth. So the goal is to give every man, woman, and maybe not child, but every man and woman a piece of the earth. So it's like an acre, 2 acres. I've done the calculation before. I've looked it up, how many arable acres there are. And there's enough for everyone in the world to have like a couple acres or something like that. And especially if you can engage in terraforming, or there's probably a better word for that, on the earth itself, but like going into desert environments and changing the climate in various ways somehow. Or, you know, using aquaponics and like artificial agricultural techniques that require a high intensity of labor. But the idea here is you get low skilled labor and make those people more valuable, because you're not, this isn't a traditional compensate, this isn't a business, right? This is something else. It's more like a religion. It's more like a global change in way of life, a whole new worldview shift. So you get people in, it's not a compensation paradigm, it's a paternalistic, we're looking after you, we're guiding you paradigm. So you get someone, they have the prospect of, I want to be in nature on my acre of land or my 2 acres of land. I feel comfortable where I am. There's like community resources that I have access to in various ways, people that I have access to. You can use social networking to group communities together based on personality characteristics. There's all sorts of possibilities here. But the basic idea is you need the university first so that then you can solidify that epistemology. And all of the various branches of science need to be grouped together somehow. You can achieve this partly with symposiums. Say you do have, like the university is broken up into different colleges. You have the heads of the various colleges meet on a regular basis, discuss research, or you have like a diagram, maybe a web document, something like that, that diagrams out the entire philosophy from metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and then down from metaphysics to physics, cosmology, and all of the different branches of physics and chemistry and everything, right? How does all aspects of the worldview, how do they fit together? That's the question. So you need an organization that's able to integrate all of that knowledge into the best possible fit. And that's an epistemological principle that I don't think has been employed enough, where it's like, it's coherentism, everything has to work together. But within any given theory in a particular science, let's look at which interpretations of quantum mechanics are consistent with, philosophically, other fields of knowledge, other kinds of philosophies. So we need the set of theories that all work together. That's what we're looking for. There's all sorts of ways to try to optimize that function of looking for the set of theories that work together and to generate new theories. You want a capacity for people to move up through the system. You want to be able to go to the university, to take classes online. And you also want, there's another warrior element where you want to be able to send people out into the surrounding environment. Now, that could be part of a eugenics program within the community where you have people who kind of fall out on a regular basis. You have the bottom 10%, 20%, whatever, fall out of the system, perhaps. This is just one notion. And you support those people by still giving them their 1 acre or 2 acres, but they are not in the community, they're out on their own or something like that. But you support them so that the genetic influence and ideological influence of the community spreads. Judaism does something like this with its core group and its peripheral circles of identity. So a structure something like that. And you scale this sort of structure by mass recruiting, advertising. And what gives me hope is that, mass agriculture, everything is built on farming, right? At heart, the economy rests on the land. That's it. That's the base. If you have the people, you can do everything else. Everything else that's required, all the mining, everything else. But first you need food. And mass agriculture is not the most efficient. It's the most efficient economically, but it's not the most efficient in terms of resource usage. The most efficient techniques are permaculture and things like that. And those are labor intensive, but that's okay because we have this whole classes of people who are going to be rendered obsolete in the competition with automation, AI, and all the other stuff, the threats that I mentioned before. People, if they're told you can move back to the land, this is basically a neo-feudal model that I'm discussing here, and I've discussed it for years, and I'm not the only one to think along these lines. But the advantage this system can have is that you don't compensate people to farm their 1 acre. You incorporate them in a broader ideological system and help them engage in permaculture as efficiently as possible. And you redistribute a portion of what they make. And this can also incorporate compensation elements, remunerative elements, because you can have, like you would have with a serf, you collect a portion of the produce and then the people get to keep a portion. But maybe they only keep what they need to eat. You take the rest, you sell on the broader market, and also redistribute within the communities themselves. And then you give back money that is made through that sale so that the people there on the land don't even have to drive it out, don't have to truck it out somewhere. That's all taken care of by specialists within the structure. This kind of economic cooperation is possible. It is absolutely possible. And you've been, and I don't mean this like you in particular, but people, everyone, has been gaslit into thinking that you can't have beneficial, intentional community. You can't have a tribe. You can't have a group that helps you. You have to operate on your own. And by the way, the future is absolutely uncertain, and your identity doesn't matter. You don't have to believe that, right? You don't have to go to the mainstream academic institutions. This kind of system can be built. Let me just, for the purpose of illustration, like, how do you get from here to there? So the first thing is a school. Well, one way to do that would be you all give me money and I build a school. That's unlikely, right? You're not going to give me money. If you do want to give me money, I have a Patreon. I have this sort of ambition, and that's where my funds will eventually go. But one way of doing this, I'm just going to lay this out as a possibility, is you get people together to invest it's like this. Land is cheaper when you buy in large quantities. And so if you have 100 people go in on 100 acres and split it up so they each get 1 acre, that 1 acre that each person gets is much, much cheaper than they would find if they were trying to buy just 1 acre by itself. The markup is insane. So even if you doubled the price that someone paid for 1 acre in 100 acres, if you have the networking capacity, which thanks to the internet, people like us have, if you can get that networking capacity to get 100 people together and each of them pays, $2,000 for 1 acre as opposed to the $1,000 that it would cost, then you can get each person their acre and an additional 100 acres that is collective, or perhaps is belonging to this school idea. So this is one way to do it. You get a large group of people, whatever the number is, you pool money together, a portion, maybe a fixed amount, say like $500 goes to the land for the school, right? And then the remainder of each individual contribution goes to their land that's just going to be theirs. It's just their investment. And it's obviously a good idea to be diversified in your investments. Don't hold all your money in cash, because the value of cash is not guaranteed. Even if you don't have money anywhere but the bank, you're still investing in currency. And currencies are wildly fluctuating and not secure at all. Land is a lot more secure. So maybe it's a good idea to have a couple grand $2,000, something like that, invested in at least something, at least some real estate that's going to be there in the future. So you get people together, $500 goes to the collective, everything else minus legal fees, real estate fees. What you would want to do is hire lawyers or a lawyer to write up a contract for this whole group to do the subdivision. Most states you can't do it. There are states where you can. So I've researched those sorts of possibilities. It is possible. But what you need is people with agency to do something. And that's a rare attribute, right? All of these changes are coming. You want to respond to them somehow. And there are real possibilities, but they're hard to see. And it's easy to do nothing and watch YouTube videos and get distracted. On your own, the odds of you becoming a billionaire and joining the elites are almost nil because they have their networks and they are closed networks. If you spent, I'm going to assume like you're at least 18, maybe I have younger viewers as well, but say you're just going into college. You do the best you possibly can. You make $300,000 a year out of school. Obviously, you're getting a graduate education, probably a PhD to make that kind of money. And really you're a doctor and very few other things, you'll get that kind of money. Well, okay, you save up everything you need to save. And what do you get out of that? Maybe you can do embryo selection and gene editing on your kid and get a highly performing child, but you're not involved in any larger group. It's not guaranteed that you're going to have access to elite networks. Maybe you will, but what do those elite networks want? Is it good for you in the long run? I think in the background of all of this is like you need an epistemological framework and an ethical framework to see what kind of world is this? What is good for me in it? Those are the basic questions. The elites don't answer because they put out the ideal of materialism and scientism, which is nihilistic and vacuous, and then amongst themselves have this kind of like will affirming black magic corrupt stuff. So I don't know, if you're worried about your soul, if you're worried about the prospects for your children, think about how you want to respond to these sorts of threats. I, of course, have Peer Academy, which is one attempt at some kind of academic framework because that has to be the core. That's the core. Everything's built around that. Of course, if somehow I was able to start doing things with an actual seed community academy first, then I would do that. But you can reach me on Peer Academy, and you'll get the Discord links from there. But thank you for listening. Don't ignore AI because it's not going away. And it's not just AI. There are other threats, and they're already being deployed now against you and yours and your class. And to respond to it, you have to be aware of it and not simplify your worldview into the kind of caricatures we've seen in some of these circles over the past few years. Thank you for listening.